Star Destroyers are some of the most iconic spaceships in the Star Wars universe. The Galactic Empire had an estimated 25,000 at the peak of its strength, yet they only sent about 30 to fight the rebels at the Battle of Endor. So what happened to the literal thousands of other destroyers after the death of the Emperor and the fall of the Empire? In this video, I'm going to take a look at 5 different perspectives about what happened to them from the current Disney canon as well as the old and goated expanded universe. The timelines diverge quite dramatically, so it's fascinating to contrast and compare what happened to these legendary ships from both. Let's start this video by discussing the Empire's actual defeat by the Rebel Alliance and the rise of the New Republic. Firstly, the Rebels didn't actually win the war at Endor in canon. There's no doubt that it was definitely a massive turning point because they'd taken out the Empire's head of state and his most obvious successor. However, the reality is that they still had massive forces spread across the galaxy and experienced military leaders who were capable of conventional victories against the rebels. In Return of the Jedi, we see that the Imperial fleet loses the Executor, several Imperial-class Star Destroyers, and at least one Tector-class. The exact numbers have never been confirmed in canon, but it's a crucial moment because the chain of command broke. However, despite the destruction of the Death Star and Darth Vader's flagship, they still had more than enough power to win the day. In the story, The Levers of Power, The Rise of the Empire, Admiral Ray Sloane eventually assumes command of the surviving forces after assassinating ISB loyalty officer Amar Otcraig. She ordered the fleet to regroup in the Anaj system, where she expected to take the fight to the rebels again. However, ultimately this didn't happen, with the next decisive encounter occurring at Jakku. That's when the Empire unleashed its most insane plan, Operation Cinder. Primarily designed by one of Palpatine's most loyal subordinates, Gallius Rax. He was the architect of their last stand at Jakku in what was basically a doomsday scenario. It involved hundreds of Imperial Star Destroyers that rammed into enemy ships, with many more destroyed in space. Some also crash-landed on Jakku's surface, as we see decades later in The Force Awakens. The Republic also suffered serious losses in this battle because it was expecting a conventional fight, not this radical approach. The canon Aftermath novel series outlines how Rax set up the Imperial forces to deliberately fail. It's an intentional self-destruction that's designed to punish the surviving Imperials for outlasting their Emperor, and to punish the New Republic with a Pyrrhic victory. Another element of Operation Cinder saw Rax and his extreme Palpatine loyalists inflict carnage on many planets that they perceived had resisted or failed the late Emperor. These included Naboo, Burnin Khan, and Vardos. The radical Imperials used satellites to trigger artificial climate disasters on these worlds, although Naboo was saved from total destruction. It was also the ultimate test of the surviving Imperial forces, with loyalists brutally culling those who refused to participate in the slaughter. Many Star Destroyers also rained fire down upon the planets below in a brutal and unforgiving assault. Sloane ultimately assassinated Rax, whom she deemed to be a fanatical radical. But she still followed the Emperor's plan and fled to the unknown regions because she believed this was the best chance of reviving its former glory. She succeeded in saving between 50 and 100 Star Destroyers, a mere fraction of the Empire's staggering forces. The canon novel Bloodlines emphasizes the legacy of the devastation and waste of life at the Battle of Jakku. We also get many horrified perspectives, including that of Wedge Antilles in the Aftermath series, while Battlefront 2 also deals with it. Ultimately, this was why the New Republic decommissioned most of its fleet, rapidly downsizing its forces. We can tentatively estimate that between 3,000 and 5,000 Star Destroyers had been destroyed by the time of the Battle of Jakku. Several visual dictionaries confirm that the Empire had 25,000 at its peak, so what happened to the rest? The short answer is that we can't say for sure, because even the expanded canon material hasn't made this entirely clear yet. However, the only solution compatible with the events that occurred before and after is that the Republic captured and disassembled at least 18,000 of them. This decommissioning would involve breaking up their hulls for scrap on junkyard worlds like Bracca, which we see in Young Jedi Adventures and Jedi Fallen Order. They may have also scuttled the ships by plunging them into the stars under supervision to avoid the risk of pirates obtaining them. This mass decommissioning would have been made easier by the historic Galactic Concordance on Chandrila directly after the Battle of Jakku. Grand Vizier Masameda of the Empire and Chancellor Mon Mothma of the New Republic signed this peace treaty that officially signaled the end of the Galactic Civil War. Star Wars Battles That Changed the Galaxy tells us that this placed severe limitations on galactic corporations, preventing them from working with Imperial remnants. This would have made it extremely difficult for Imperial resistance groups to keep their Star Destroyers ship-shape. The New Republic now had the largest fleet in the known galaxy through the process of elimination, although the Military Disarmament Act drastically reduced it to a fraction of the size of Clone Wars-era fleets. Somewhat naively, the government wanted to focus on rebuilding the galaxy politically and no longer regarded the Imperial remnants as a serious threat. This would prove to be the undoing of the New Republic, as the sequel trilogy shows. Let's continue our foray into canon by discussing the rise of the First Order and how they used Star Destroyers. They fled into the unknown regions under the command of Ray Sloan, but time didn't stand still. According to Beaumont Kin in The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire, the Galactic Concordance that had ended the previous war placed strict limitations on the military technology and production that ex-Imperial factions were permitted. The First Order continually broke these restrictions, and the New Republic did not act. To give the Republic some credit, they also didn't really know about the First Order's full strength because it was concentrated in the unknown regions, an area of the galaxy where nobody really goes. It's full of black holes, asteroids, and hyperspace anomalies, so it's extremely dangerous to travel through. However, Emperor Palpatine secretly spent decades mapping the unknown regions and established his secret cloning facility on the Sith world of Exegol. As I mentioned earlier, Admiral Sloan took fewer than 100 Star Destroyers with her. Over the following couple of decades, the First Order upgraded and refitted its fleet, developing new Star Destroyer lines including the Resurgent class and the insanely overpowered Xyston class. These rendered the iconic Imperial-class Star Destroyers obsolete, so it's likely they gradually scrapped them as they expanded their modernized fleet. One of the most polarizing aspects of the sequel trilogy is how quickly the First Order appears to upgrade its fleet. While it's definitely fair to question the sheer number of ships they have under their control by the time of The Rise of Skywalker, I will defend the advancements in ship technology, especially when it comes to the Resurgent-class Star Destroyer. Don't forget that the Empire essentially did the same thing with the Venator class after the Clone Wars ended. The First Order was a hyper-militarized society whose sole focus was gaining power and preparing for conflict with the New Republic. The Resurgent class is actually a really cool Star Destroyer that definitely carries on the spirit of previous models. It's very obviously still a Star Destroyer with that distinctive wedge shape, giving it an intimidating aura. However, it was much larger than the Imperial class at a behemoth 2,900 meters in length. It's not all about size, though, because it actually improved on former models in several ways. The Force Awakens' incredible cross-sections explains that it had improved hull bracing, so it was less likely to brace apart after impact. It's also very noticeable that the Resurgent class doesn't have an exposed bridge, so captains didn't need to worry about single starfighters crashing into them and wiping them out. They also had a reserve bridge at the midpoint of the ship for standby personnel to take command if the primary bridge was damaged or destroyed. This impressive ship became the backbone of the First Order's fleet and was a superb next-generation Star Destroyer. The next ship I want to talk about is the Mantator IV class Siege Dreadnought, which was basically the First Order's upgrade of the old Executor class Super Star Destroyers. The Last Jedi Incredible Cross-Sections explains that it was 2.5 times bigger than the Resurgent Star Destroyers. Poe Dameron describes it as a fleet killer in Episode 8, and he's not wrong. This reference book also says that it had more firepower than 8 standard Star Destroyers combined. It had 2 orbital autocannons, 26 anti-aircraft cannons, and a crew of almost 200,000, not counting stormtroopers. This was a staggering ship, and it infamously laid waste to Tanahua in the Allegiance comic book series. Even larger than this was the outrageous Mega-class Star Destroyer, the biggest ship ever in Star Wars canon. The scale of this ship is almost beyond belief, but it still feels compatible with the Star Destroyer lineage because despite its staggering size, it boasts conventional weapons. The Last Jedi Incredible Cross-Section says that it had 32 sublight engines and carried over 2.2 million personnel. Meanwhile, up to 6 Resurgent-class Star Destroyers could dock along the aft portion of its massive wings, as well as 2 inside. The First Order only had one of these colossal beasts in their fleet, the Supremacy, Supreme Commander Snoke's flagship. It appeared invincible, but couldn't stop a woman with purple hair from smashing a Mon Cal cruiser through it and splitting it in half. Finally, let's talk about the most controversial First Order Star Destroyer, the Xyston class. This line of ships strongly resembles the standard Imperial class. It may appear to just be a refitted Imperial Star Destroyer, but this wasn't the case. Essential Guides reveals that it had a larger hull and a different internal layout. The most obvious difference was that it had a miniaturized axial superlaser, or planet buster. The Mega class was the biggest vessel in their fleet, but the Xyston is definitely the most overpowered ship in the official Star Wars canon. The silhouette is unmistakably similar to those of the previous Victory class and Imperial class Star Destroyers, especially because it still has the exposed bridge. This suggests that work on the Xyston class began before the First Order developed their line of resurgent Star Destroyers. They likely completed the shell of the ships before they fully developed axial lasers that wouldn't consume the entire vessel itself when fired. The main problem that Star Wars fans have with the First Order fleet is that they have so many ships. The Rise of Skywalker novelization emphasizes their mass production at Exegol. Meanwhile, the Resistance itself arose under Princess Leia because she could see that there was a growing military threat in the galaxy that the New Republic refused to take seriously, at least on an official governmental level. I think that the technological development of the new ships that replaced their old Imperial-class Star Destroyers is entirely consistent with what happened during the Clone Wars and the rise of the Galactic Empire. Don't forget, the First Order basically had Quat drive yards in their pocket. They used a subsidiary called Quat Intralia that secretly mass-produced their fleet off-site in the unknown regions. Quat drive yards has a history of dubious business dealings because they also secretly constructed the Republic's Venator-class Star Destroyers before the Clone Wars, before the Republic even knew they'd need a fleet. However, there's no denying that the mass production of the Xyston class remains one of the most debatable and confusing aspects of the sequel trilogy. What do you like or dislike about the First Order fleet? Let me know in the comments below. For most of the rest of this video, we're going to look at legend sources and storylines. These novels, comics, and video games give us fascinating alternative perspectives about what happened to the Imperial fleet after the Battle of Yavin. It's also fair to say that in the eyes of many fans, this remains their preferred canon. One of the joys of being a Star Wars fan is that there are different continuities you can choose from, almost like a multiverse. The victory at the Battle of Endor didn't represent the end of the war in the Legends timeline either. It was a massive turning point and enabled the establishment of a new republic, because the surviving Imperial forces fragmented, with warlords jostling for power and influence. Some, like Ysanne Isard, had visions of grandeur and believed that they could re-establish the Empire, with themselves in the hot seat. Others, like High Admiral Daala and Warlord Zsinj, didn't care about that, and just wanted to grab as much power as they could. This saw a massive scramble for resources because the warlords with the most powerful fleets obviously had the strongest claims to the Empire's lineage. Let's get the weak warlords out of the way first. These are the ones who had more titles than ships and the strategic nous of a bantha. High Admiral Truton Teradoc was the supreme military ruler of the Greater Maldrude, a militarily powerful former Imperial faction. He ruled his little kingdom from the Reaper, an Imperial Star Destroyer. Teradoc and his brother Kosh featured in the X-Wing novels as antagonists as well as in the Essential Guide to Warfare. The short version of their story is that Teradoc exercised ridiculous brutality against his own people. He believed mass executions would help him maintain control, and that because he had a few Star Destroyers, he was the big boss. Then, his equally charming brother Kosh, the captain of the Virulence, assassinated him. Unfortunately for their subordinates, this was bad news because he was even more sadistic and ran his faction like a gang. Ultimately, he dies during the Second Battle of Borleas in Isard's Revenge. The Teradoc brothers are perfect examples of Imperial officers who almost stumbled into power because they commanded Star Destroyers, but blew every opportunity to actually do something effective with them. Others included High Admiral Delvardis, who somehow found himself in control of a Super Star Destroyer, the ridiculous Tricollis, who pretended he was the Emperor's son, and the cybernetic torture addict Admiral Blitzer Harsk, who fell victim to the notorious warlord Zsinj. Zsinj was a genuinely serious player, and not a clown warlord like some of the names I've mentioned already. He was the first big bad in Michael A. Stackpole's brilliant X-Wing series, and was already an established Imperial Admiral before Endor. Unlike the previous warlords, Zsinj was always politically ambitious, commanding and influencing many fleet elements. Because of this, he found himself in a strong position, and immediately framed himself as Palpatine's rightful successor. Many weaker warlords and captains flocked to his banner because it became clear he knew what he was doing, and had the muscle to back it up. This was also before the re-emergence of Grand Admiral Thrawn or Ysanne Isard. The pivotal moment in Zsinj's rise came in the novel Wraith Squadron, when he acquired the Super Star Destroyer Iron Fist. Of course, he wouldn't be a true warlord if he didn't have some kind of crazy quirk. Zsinj's was the pet rancor that he kept on board his flagship. While he held more ships than most of his contemporaries, he did make some key strategic mistakes and was very arrogant. This led to his downfall. On the topic of Star Destroyers, it's worth noting that his forces used many of the old Victory class because they were smaller and easier to crew than the Imperial Star Destroyer. This was a common trend post-Endor. Zsinj, like many hubristic warlords, believed that because he had an Executor-class Star Destroyer, he was untouchable. The New Republic regarded him as a top-tier strategic threat and committed key resources, including Rogue and Wraith squadrons, to take him down. Ultimately, they lure the Iron Fist into a trap over Salagas, and the fallout leads to Zsinj's assassination. It was another waste of one of the most powerful Imperial weapons. Next up was Ysanne Isard, who served as the Emperor's Director of Imperial Intelligence before the Galactic Civil War. She literally betrayed her father to get the job and earned herself the nickname Iceheart, a moniker she lived up to throughout her violent career. After the fall of the Emperor, to whom she was intensely loyal, she consolidated power. It also helped that Imperial intelligence was one of the surviving Empire's most intact institutions. Unlike other leaders, Isard mostly had career captains under her command rather than greedy warlords. They believed that she was strong enough to hold a centralized government and reclaim the Empire's past glories. It helped that she had access to the Lusankya, an Executor-class Star Destroyer buried deep under Coruscant's surface. First, Isard unleashed the Krytos virus across the planet, targeting non-human species. Then she activated the Lusankya, which she had previously been using as a secret prison. The Super Star Destroyer ripped through Coruscant's cityscape, killing millions in the Krytos trap. Obviously, its staggering firepower gave her growing fleet a massive boost until everything went wrong, but I won't spend too much time on that. Inevitably, she loses because she underestimates the New Republic's capacity to rebound from the disaster on Coruscant. Rogue Squadron has a massive role in bringing her down. You'd think that Imperials would eventually come to respect fighter jockeys, but no, some things don't change. I highly recommend Stackpole's X-Wing novels and still maintain they'd make a brilliant TV series. The reality is that while a few Super Star Destroyers were floating around the galaxy in the Legends continuity, the overwhelming majority were the standard Imperial class. A single warlord could wreak plenty of havoc with fewer than a handful under their command if they tried. Admiral Daala is the perfect example in Kevin J. Anderson's Jedi Academy trilogy. Daala is a remarkable character because, arguably, nobody in the Star Wars Legends universe has failed upwards as successfully as her. The Jedi Academy trilogy emphasizes that she's a brilliant military commander. It claims that she was the first female admiral in Imperial history after Grand Moff Tarkin recognized her talents and promoted her. Interestingly, women in the Legends continuity face more discrimination than in the canon timeline. Anyway, Daala spent a decade guarding the secret Maw installation with a fleet of 4 Imperial Star Destroyers and the Sun Crusher, one of the most insane superweapons in any Star Wars story. Han Solo, Chewbacca, and Kip Duran managed to steal it away, so Daala decides to use her destroyers to wreak havoc across the galaxy. She definitely causes some chaos, but ultimately she fails to register as a long-term threat to the New Republic. Daala's methods were about as subtle as a rancor in a bantha pen. She had a habit of dropping her Star Destroyers in front of their targets and immediately opening fire. This had some success at Mon Calamari and against some weaker opponents. However, this overly aggressive response also cost her dearly, because she put her Star Destroyers directly in the line of fire. Daala lost the Hydra on their retreat from Mon Calamari after underestimating the planetary defenses. Later, the Republic picked off her other Star Destroyers because she isolated them in battle, or, in the case of the Basilisk, sent it on a mission without support. The irony is that her 4 Imperial Star Destroyers made her an instant power in the galaxy. However, she failed to use them strategically, and this was an absolute waste. Star Destroyers work best in coordination with other ships like anti-starfighter Lancer-class frigates, escort cruisers such as the Carrack class, and even other smaller destroyers like the Victory. Daala herself was as unkillable as a cockroach, and even bounced back to lead the Galactic Alliance at one point, exiling Luke Skywalker. But there's no argument that she didn't know how to use Star Destroyers properly, unlike arguably the greatest Imperial fleet commander of them all. Of course, I'm talking about Grand Admiral Thrawn, one of the most compelling antagonists in the Legends Star Wars universe. The Chiss commander re-emerged from the unknown regions about 9 years after the Battle of Yavin, and instantly became an existential threat against the Republic. From creating his own clone army to finding ways to inhibit the Force, Thrawn was an absolute genius. He also didn't waste his Star Destroyers like so many of his predecessors. In Timothy Zahn's original Thrawn trilogy, we see how he uses the Chimera and his other Imperial Star Destroyers as command ships. They do not bear the brunt of assaults because they're too valuable. He used them in conjunction with other support ships, which was much more tactically sound. One of Thrawn's key strategies was securing the location of the Katana fleet. This was a near-legendary fleet of dreadnoughts that he hoped to make the foundation of his fleet. He obtained 178 of these Old Republic ships in a massive boost to his forces, putting the beleaguered New Republic on the back foot. Thrawn recognized that Star Destroyers have tier advantages, but also many flaws. They take time and a lot of resources to build, repair, and replace. Meanwhile, they require massive crews, making them less economically viable for a struggling power. Ultimately, Thrawn comes incredibly close to achieving his schemes and rebuilding the Empire. However, he underestimated his Noghri bodyguard, Rook, who assassinated him at the cost of his own life during the Battle of Bilbringi in The Last Command. Thrawn's pragmatism is on display at Sluis Van, the first major engagement in his conflict against the New Republic. He made a point of telling his second-in-command, Captain Pellaeon, "We're here to gain ships, not lose them." The Grand Admiral intended to steal Republic ships to enhance his fleet, but Lando Calrissian thwarted it. Instead of staying and fighting, Thrawn recognized that the Republic was the bigger loser in this scenario, and it was better to escape with his forces intact. Thrawn only ever had between 12 and 20 Star Destroyers under his command, with only 6 of those completely loyal. Thrawn set the standard for the military commanders who were set to follow him over the coming decade. Star Destroyers would retain deep symbolic importance, but they'd become less visible throughout the galaxy. Let's continue with our journey through the Legends universe by looking at the Imperial Remnant. This was a new political movement that emerged under Captain Pellaeon between 12 and 18 years after the Battle of Yavin. Again, Timothy Zahn was the driving force behind its creation in his Hand of Thrawn duology. Crucially, the new Imperial Remnant recognizes the Republic and chooses to coexist in a separate section of space. Jagged Fel became the head of state alongside a ruling Moff Council, while Pellaeon was supreme commander of their fleet. So let's go back to the question of what happened to all the Star Destroyers. The reality is that there really weren't that many left by this time. As I've tried to emphasize, many warlords wasted them, or they fell into disrepair in the decades after Yavin. The remaining Star Destroyers were a valuable commodity, but also a potential resource drain if misused. Pellaeon served directly under Thrawn, so he carried on his mentor's strategy of using Imperial Star Destroyers as command ships instead of putting them in harm's way when possible. Actually, the heavily armed Tector was a better option against capital ships because of its increased firepower. The Victory class was also popular because of its smaller crew complement and excellent shielding. They also increasingly used cruisers instead of standard Star Destroyers because they were faster, more efficient, and cheaper to build. An example was the Enforcer-class picket cruiser. The Essential Guide to Warfare explains how Kuat Drive Yards designed this with Sinar fleet systems for the Pentastar alignment, which later joined the Imperial Remnant. It's easy to see why they became popular with their relatively small crews of just 3,000 plus 60 gunners. These ships were part of the Star Destroyer line and retain that distinctive dagger-like wedge silhouette. However, they don't carry the Star Destroyer name. Star Wars Adventure Journal 8 explains that it was common for them to be used in squadrons of 4 to 8 ships, which makes sense because of their smaller size. It's also worth noting that Imperial doctrine drastically changed during this period. They were no longer governed by a Dark Lord of the Sith and his psychotic genocidal minions like Darth Vader and Grand Moff Tarkin. The new Imperial Remnant was more concerned about survival and strategic success, rather than intimidation and striking instant fear into the hearts of their opponents in a major evolution. The canon novel Tarkin reveals how the future Grand Moff created the philosophy behind the original Empire's military approach. The short version of this is that they wanted to terrify their subjects and potential rivals into submission. Their use of Executor-class Star Destroyers, Death Stars, and disproportionate violence were all part of this doctrine. The new doctrine even inspired a new line of Palaeon-class Star Destroyers about a century after the Battle of Yavin in the Legacy comic book series. This shows the Fel Empire's evolution from a brutal, cruel regime to an austere but fair one, concerned with law and order. Unsurprisingly, the New Republic had a complicated relationship with captured or decommissioned Star Destroyers. These ships were deeply symbolic, so some leaders, including Mon Mothma, didn't want to incorporate them into the Republic military. But in times of crises, beggars couldn't be choosers. In canon, there's not much information about these vessels except that the Republic made the fatal decision to decommission most of its forces. However, things are more interesting and complex in Legends. Sometimes it made strategic sense to use Star Destroyers to deceive the Imperial forces. We see this in the X-Wing series when the Republic mounts a false flag operation against Ysanne Isard. They used the Tyrant, a former member of Darth Vader's Death Squadron, who even appeared on screen in Episode 5 above Hoth. The ship fell into Republic hands, and they renamed it the Rebel Dream. Princess Leia even used it as her flagship in the novel The Truce at Bakura. Imperial forces eventually recaptured it, but the Republic got it back, maintaining it until the Yuuzhan Vong War. We know that the New Republic also used several recaptured Star Destroyers against Isard and Thrawn because they didn't have much choice. Typically, they repainted the livery with the iconic Rebel Starbird and gave them new names like the Justice, the Freedom, and the Unity. The Lusankya was the only Executor-class Star Destroyer in New Republic hands. This isn't surprising because the line of ships isn't compatible with their conventional strategy or their political doctrine. But sometimes it's very useful to have a massive ship with a lot of guns. The Republic military took the damaged ship to a secret facility after its near destruction at the Battle of Thyfera in the Bacta War. Many of the Republic's High Council didn't even know that it had survived. The Essential Guide to Warfare explains that it was kept as a medical facility in the Skarl system before it was refitted for active duty against the Dark Empire. The Lusankya saw heavy action during the Yuuzhan Vong War, and eventually it was sacrificed to bring down a world ship during Operation Emperor's Spear in the New Jedi Order series. It had served the New Republic for about 20 years by this point, which is actually quite impressive. Finally, I want to wrap this video up by talking about Star Destroyers outside of Imperial and Republic control. Remember, there were over 25,000 across the galaxy at the Empire's peak, so it stands to reason that at least a couple fell into civilian hands. We actually don't have many examples of this in Legends or canon. The most iconic one is Booster Tarek's notorious errant venture. Tarek is a larger-than-life smuggler who spent a chunk of his life in Kessel's spice mines. Originally named the Virulence, Republic forces captured the ship with Tarek's assistance before turning it against Ysanne Isard's forces at Thyfera. Tarek successfully bargained with General Aaron Kraken to keep the Imperial Star Destroyer as a reward for his assistance. Kraken reluctantly agreed on the condition that the Republic strip it of its weapon systems. Tarek renamed the ship and painted it bright red because being an Imperial Star Destroyer wasn't visible enough for him. The smuggler assisted the Republic many times over the following years after the errant venture went through many weapons refits. In one case, it even secured some of the Lusankya's batteries. However, Tarek's main use of the errant venture was as a shadow port and a mobile black market hub for his fellow underworld figures. The Legends novels make it clear how challenging it was for him to operate an Imperial Star Destroyer. Tarek is down to a skeleton crew many times and constantly struggles with repairs. At one point, he even hired 200 Verpine technicians to upgrade the ship. Tarek's experience also sums up why Star Destroyers weren't always the answer. Throughout Legends, it became increasingly challenging for Imperial forces to refit, upgrade, or build new ships as they lost access to shipyards and key resources. Even finding enough crew members was a massive challenge. This is why there weren't many pirate gangs flying around the galaxy in captured Star Destroyers. They simply weren't able to keep them in the sky.